The night I found him, the storm had torn the sky open like a wound that would never heal. I did not know then that saving a dying creature in the dark would one day make me a queen. I was 15 years old, an orphan with no name worth remembering, surviving on the edges of a pack that barely tolerated my existence. The wolves of Ashenmoor allowed me to sleep in the barn and eat their scraps because my mother had once belonged to them, before she died giving birth to a daughter whose wolf never came. I was a ghost among the living, invisible until someone needed wood chopped or bread baked or silence kept. The other children ran past me as if I were made of mist, and the adults looked through me as if I had already faded into nothing. That night, the thunder shook the walls of the barn so violently that the horses screamed in their stalls. Something pulled me outside, a whisper I could not name, a feeling deep in my chest like a thread tugging me toward the black forest. The rain was cold and relentless, turning the earth to rivers of mud. But I wrapped myself in my mother's old cloak and followed the feeling through darkness so complete I could barely see my own hands before me. I found him beneath the roots of the great oak, the one the elders said had stood since before the first wolves walked on two legs. He was small, barely larger than my forearm, his white fur matted with blood and mud and something darker I could not name. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was so shallow I had to press my hand against his tiny ribs to feel any movement at all. I thought he was dead until I saw the faint trembling of his paws against the frozen ground. He was fighting to live. Even then, even broken and abandoned, he was fighting. A white wolf. I had heard the stories whispered around the fires, spoken in voices hushed with reverence and fear. White wolves were sacred, blessed by the old spirits, born once in a generation to lead their people through darkness. They belonged to the ancient bloodlines, to kings and prophecies and things far beyond the reach of an orphan girl who smelled of hay and loneliness. I should have told someone. I should have carried him to the Alpha and let them decide his fate. The punishment for hiding such a creature would be severe. But when I lifted him into my arms and felt his small heart beating against my chest, fragile as a bird's wing, something inside me broke open like a dam releasing water that had been held back for years. He was alone. He was dying. And I knew, with a certainty that lived in my bones, what it meant to be both of those things at once. I carried him to the hidden grotto behind the waterfall, the place I had discovered years ago when I needed somewhere to cry where no one could hear me. The cave was small and damp, smelling of moss and stone, but it was safe. I laid him on a bed of soft green moss and cleaned his wounds with water from the stream, my hands shaking with cold and fear and something else I could not name. He whimpered but did not wake. I stayed with him through the night and the day that followed, my body curved around his to keep him warm, my heartbeat steady against his failing one. For 3 weeks, I kept him alive. I stole bread from the kitchens and soaked it in goat milk until it was soft enough for him to swallow. I gathered herbs the way my mother had taught me before she died, pressing poultices of yarrow and comfrey against his wounds until they closed into pale scars beneath his white fur. I talked to him constantly, telling him stories about the forest and the stars and the mother I could barely remember. I gave him a name in the silence of my heart, though I never spoke it aloud. I called him Meoluar, my moonlight, because his fur glowed like the moon when the morning light touched it through the cave entrance. He grew stronger with each passing day. His eyes opened on the 7th morning, and they were the color of amber, deep and ancient and impossibly knowing. He watched me with an intelligence that made me forget he was only a wolf. When I spoke, he listened with his head tilted as if he understood every word. When I cried, as I often did in those lonely weeks, he pressed his cold nose against my cheek and made a sound low in his throat that felt like comfort. When I told him I was afraid of never belonging anywhere, of living and dying invisible, he curled tighter against my side as if to say, "You belong to me now." I loved him, not the way a girl loves a pet, but the way the sea loves the shore, completely and without reason or restraint. He was the first living thing that had ever needed me, the first creature that looked at me and saw something worth saving. And then one morning, I woke to find the moss beside me cold and empty. I searched for days, calling his name into the wind until my voice broke and bled. I returned to the grotto every night for a month, hoping to see that flash of white fur, those amber eyes watching me from the shadows. But the cave remained silent, and the forest offered no answers. I told myself he had returned to his kind, that he was running free somewhere in the wild, that this was the natural order of things. I told myself it was better this way, that I had no right to keep something so precious. But a part of me never stopped waiting. A part of me stood at that cave entrance forever, watching for moonlight. 5 years passed like water through my fingers. I left Ashenmoor the day I turned 18, no longer willing to live on scraps and silence and the cold charity of wolves who would never see me as one of their own. I built a small cabin at the edge of the Thornwood, close enough to the village to sell my bread, but far enough that no one bothered me. The work was hard but honest. I baked before dawn and walked to market in the gray morning light. I spoke to the trees and the birds and the wind because they were the only ones who listened. My wolf never came. The healers of Ashenmoor had told me she was too weak, that some wolves simply never woke, that I would live and die in this half form, neither fully human nor fully wild. I accepted it the way I accepted everything else, with quiet grief and a determination to keep living anyway. What choice did I have? The world did not stop for broken things. The villagers thought I was strange. The women whispered that I talked to the trees, that I walked in the forest at midnight, that there was something unnatural about a woman who lived alone and wanted nothing from anyone. The men looked at me with eyes that lingered too long, seeing only a woman alone and unprotected. The local pack, the Greymoor wolves, dismissed me entirely. A wolfless woman was no threat and no prize, not worth the effort of cruelty or kindness. I existed in the spaces between, belonging to no one and nothing, until the day the king came. I heard the horses before I saw them, a thunder of hooves that shook the ground beneath my feet and sent birds screaming from the trees. I was kneading dough when the sound reached me, flour up to my elbows, and I stepped outside to see a column of riders emerging from the forest like something out of a fever dream. Their banners were black and silver, marked with the sigil of a wolf howling at a crescent moon, the sigil of the Northern Kingdom, the great power that ruled the mountain territories beyond the reach of ordinary wolves. The villagers poured into the streets, their faces pale with fear and awe. The northern wolves were legends, warriors who had unified the scattered packs through blood and fire, and an iron will that knew no compromise. Their alpha king, Theron, was said to be merciless, a man who had crushed every rebellion and buried every enemy beneath the snow of his frozen kingdom. No one knew why he had come to our forgotten village at the edge of nowhere. But I knew. The moment I saw him, I knew with a certainty that made my blood sing. He rode at the front of the column on a horse black as midnight, his cloak billowing behind him like wings of shadow. His hair was dark, streaked with silver at the temples like frost on iron, and his face was carved from stone, all sharp angles and deep shadows that spoke of years spent making impossible choices. But it was his eyes that stopped my breath. They were amber, deep and ancient, and impossibly knowing. They were the eyes of a dying pup I had held against my heart in a hidden cave. He dismounted in the village square, and the crowd parted like water before a blade. His gaze swept over the villagers, over the crumbling buildings and the frightened faces, until it found me, standing alone at the edge of the crowd, flour on my hands, my mother's old cloak around my shoulders. He walked toward me, and the world went silent. I should have bowed. I should have lowered my eyes the way everyone else did, but I could not move. I could only stare at those amber eyes and feel something stir in my chest, something that had been sleeping for so long I had forgotten it existed. He stopped an arm's length away. Up close, I could see the scars on his jaw, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years of war and grief and the weight of a crown no one else could carry. He radiated power the way the sun radiates heat. "You are Brielle," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding in a river. It was not a question. I found my voice somewhere in the ruins of my shock. "I am." He studied me for a long moment. "Do you know who I am?" "You are Theron," I said. "King of the Northern Pax." He shook his head slowly, and there was sadness in the gesture. "I am the father of the wolf you saved." The ground tilted beneath me. I remembered the white pup, the amber eyes, but that was impossible. The pup had been small, barely weaned. "My son?" he said, reading my confusion. "Castiel. He was taken during an attack on our camp when he was only weeks old, stolen by enemies who wanted to break me. We searched for years, but we never found him. We believed he was dead." His voice cracked on that last word, until he came home, until he told us about the girl who saved his life. I could not speak. The world was spinning too fast. "In the old ways," he continued, "when a wolf owes a life debt, it can only be repaid with bond. My son owes you his life. By the ancient law, you are claimed." "Claimed," I whispered. "I do not understand." "As my queen," he said, "as the woman destined to rule beside me." The words fell like stones into still water. I looked at this king and saw something in his eyes that I recognized. Loneliness. The same loneliness I had carried my whole life. I did not want a crown. I told him that. I told him I was no one, a wolfless orphan who baked bread and talked to trees. I told him there must be some mistake, but he only smiled, a sad and knowing smile. "Fate is not a thing we choose," he said. "It chooses us. It found you in that storm 15 years ago. The journey north took 3 weeks. I rode beside the king in a carriage that felt like a gilded cage, watching familiar forests give way to mountains so tall they scraped the sky. The air grew colder as we climbed, sharp with pine and snow. Theron visited me each evening, answering my questions with surprising patience. He told me about his kingdom, a realm of ice and iron where wolves ran free beneath the northern lights. He told me about his people, proud and fierce and loyal. He told me about his son, the white wolf prince who had grown into a warrior as fierce as his father. But he did not tell me why my wolf had never woken. And when I pressed him about Castiel, he changed the subject with diplomatic skill. There were secrets in his silences. The northern kingdom rose from the mountains like a dream carved in stone. The castle was ancient, its towers reaching toward the clouds. Wolves lined the courtyards, hundreds of them, watching in silence as my carriage passed through the gates. Not all of them were welcoming. I met Morven on my first night. She was Theron's sister, a woman with hair like ink and eyes like glacial ice. She smiled when she greeted me, but her smile did not reach her eyes. "The bread girl," she said loud enough for the nobles to hear. "Tell me, do you know how to curtsy?" She looked at me the way a hawk looks at a mouse. I understood then that I had walked into a war I did not know how to fight. Morven had expected to rule beside her brother. She had spent years building alliances and weaving webs of influence. My arrival threatened everything she had built. She spread rumors that I was a fraud, a peasant, a wolfless pretender. She questioned my bloodline, my worthiness. Wherever I went, I heard the whispers. And she was not wrong. My wolf still slept. I could not shift, could not prove I belonged among these ancient bloodlines. I was exactly what they whispered, a pretender wearing borrowed clothes. But Theron did not waver. He announced our binding ceremony for the next full moon. He gave me chambers in the royal wing. He looked at me across crowded rooms with those amber eyes that seemed to see past every wall I had built. It was Castiel who changed everything. I met him in the gardens 3 days after my arrival. He was sitting beneath a white birch tree, his silver hair falling over his face. He looked up when I approached, and my heart stopped. His eyes were amber, the same amber I remembered from the grotto. "You remember me?" he said softly. I sank onto the bench across from him, tears blurring my vision. "Miuluar." He smiled, but there was sorrow in it. I wanted to come back. Every day. But they found me first and brought me home before I could say goodbye. "Why did you never send word?" His face darkened. When I returned, I was only a child, and my father was fighting a war. There was no time. And then the years passed, and I was afraid. Afraid of what? Of what you had become to me, he said quietly. I knew even then that the bond between us was more than gratitude. I felt it in my bones. I knew that finding you again would change everything. And I was right. The attack came on the night before the binding ceremony, when the moon hung full and heavy in the sky. I was in my chambers when I heard the screams, the clash of steel, the howls of wolves in battle. I ran to the window and saw fire spreading through the eastern courtyard. Dark shapes moved through the smoke. And above it all, I heard a name shouted like a curse. Ronan, Theron's brother, banished years ago for treason. He had returned with an army of rogues and exiles. He wanted the throne. He would burn the kingdom to get it. Something rose inside me that night, something that had been sleeping for 20 years. I felt my wolf stir in the depths of my soul, not waking, but stretching, testing the walls of her cage. I ran through the burning corridors, following instincts I did not know I had. I found Theron in the great hall, surrounded by enemies, his sword red with blood. He fought like the legend the world feared, but there were too many of them. Behind him stood Morven, watching with a smile that turned my blood to ice. She had opened the gates. She had betrayed her own blood for power. She saw me and screamed for the rogues to take me. They turned toward me, blades raised. I had no weapon. I had no wolf. And then the window exploded inward, and he was there. Castiel. He was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. A wolf larger than any I had witnessed. His white fur glowing like starlight, his eyes burning with amber fire. He tore through the rogues with a fury that shook the walls. Theron fought toward him, father and son becoming a single force of destruction. And I stood frozen, feeling my own wolf howl inside me with a voice I had never heard. She was awake. She was desperate. She was demanding to be free. "Help me," I whispered to the moon. The pain came like lightning, like being torn apart and remade in the same breath. I felt my bones break and reform, my skin split and seal, my voice shatter into a howl that silenced every battle for one frozen moment. And then I was running on 4 legs through a world that had never been so sharp, so alive. Every scent was a story. Every shadow held secrets I could finally read. My wolf was black as midnight. I threw myself at the rogues who threatened my king, my teeth finding throats and tendons with an instinct I did not question. I fought beside Theron and Castiel, beside the kingdom that was already mine. When the battle ended, dawn was breaking over the mountains. Ronan lay dead at Theron's feet. Morven knelt in chains, her face empty of everything but defeat. And I stood in the center of the great hall, my wolf panting, my soul finally whole. Theron came to me as I shifted back, wrapping his cloak around my trembling shoulders. "My queen," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My wolf, my heart." I looked up at him. "I am not the girl who saved a dying pup anymore." "No," he agreed. "You are the woman who saved a kingdom." Castiel approached, his silver hair dark with ash and blood. "You came back to me," he said, "after all this time." I touched his face, feeling the realness of him. "I never left. I was just waiting for you to find me." The binding ceremony took place 3 days later, beneath a full moon that turned the snow to rivers of silver light. I wore a gown of black and white, Wolf colors, queen colors, stitched with thread that glittered like captured stars. The great hall had been restored, the blood washed away, the broken windows replaced with glass that caught the moonlight and scattered it across the assembled wolves like a blessing from the spirits themselves. Theron stood beside me as the elders spoke the ancient words, words that had bound wolves together since before the mountains had names. His hand held mine, warm and strong, and when I looked into his amber eyes, I saw a future I had never dared to imagine. A future where I belonged. A future where I was loved not for what I could offer, but for who I had always been. Castiel stood at the front of the assembly, watching with tears in his eyes that he did not try to hide. My moonlight, my first love. The creature who had taught me that I was worth saving before I believed it myself. He bowed his head as the final words were spoken, and I understood then that the bond between us would never fade, even as it transformed into something different, something deeper. He would be my protector, my champion, the brother of my heart. And that was enough. That was more than enough. I thought of my mother as I spoke my vows. I thought of the barn where I had slept as a child, cold and alone and forgotten. I thought of the grotto where I had saved a dying pup, not knowing that I was saving myself as well. I thought of all the years of silence and loneliness and the desperate belief that I would never be enough for anyone. And I let it all go, like ashes scattered on the wind, like leaves carried away by a river that flowed toward something greater than I had ever known. I was Brielle, queen of the northern packs, wolf and woman, warrior and healer. The girl who had walked into a storm and found her destiny in the darkness. I had finally come home. The years that followed were not easy. There were battles to fight against those who still sought to tear the kingdom apart. There were alliances to forge with packs who had once been enemies. There were old wounds to heal and new ones to survive. I learned to lead, to speak with the voice of a queen, to make decisions that would shape the lives of thousands. I learned that power was not about strength alone, but about knowing when to show mercy and when to stand firm. But I was never alone. Theron stood at my side through every challenge, his amber eyes finding mine across crowded rooms, his hand reaching for mine in the quiet moments between the chaos. His love was steady and fierce, a fire that never dimmed. And Castiel ran ahead of us always, the white wolf prince who had grown into a leader in his own right, who protected our kingdom with the same devotion he had once shown a lonely orphan girl. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I would slip out of the castle and run through the forests in my wolf form, feeling the wind in my fur and the earth beneath my paws, and the moon singing in my blood, like a song I had known since before I was born. I would run until the castle was just a glimmer of light on the horizon, until the world was nothing but trees and stars and the endless sky above. In those moments, I would remember the girl who had once hidden in a grotto, holding a dying pup against her heart, whispering promises into the dark. I would remember the loneliness that had once defined my existence, the hunger for belonging that had nearly broken me. And I would feel gratitude so vast it brought tears to my eyes, gratitude for the storm that had led me to that great oak, for the thread of fate that had pulled me toward a future I could never have imagined. I kept those promises, every single one, and the moonlight followed me home.